Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We are exploring the ultimate clash of worldviews today, the battle between pure rationality and the ancient power of religious narrative. Can humanity survive without God? If we abandon religion, do we descend into nihilism and societal collapse? Or do we finally break free from dogmatism to build a world based on reason and love? We are diving into a monumental conversation to figure out what happens when we strip away our oldest myths.
Yeah, it really is an immense philosophical undertaking. I mean, we are looking at a deeply intellectual transcript today featuring three major modern thinkers.
Right. Often identified in these circles as Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, and Douglas Murray.
Exactly. And they're essentially attempting to map out the foundational architecture of human values. The stakes they're discussing, they could not be higher. They're basically asking for the minimal necessary preconditions to keep a society from tearing itself apart.
And just to set the ground rules right at the top, our mission today is to act as impartial guides. We're not here to endorse any specific political, atheistic, or religious viewpoint.
Because if you follow the culture wars even a little bit, these topics can ignite some massive arguments.
Oh, absolutely. Our goal is strictly to map out these fascinating positions on God, atheism, and the foundation of our morals so that you can navigate the ideas for yourself. Also, before we jump into the deep end, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
To really fully grasp the tension in these sources, you have to understand that this isn't just, an academic debate about ancient history. It's a live argument about how we structure our world today.
Right.
Do we absolutely need a religious superstructure to maintain a cohesive civilization? Or is modern scientific rationality robust enough to carry us forward?
Okay, let's unpack this. The core conflict here boils down to a battle between reason and revelation. Let's start with the staunch atheist, rationalist viewpoint.
Yeah, which makes a very firm claim.
It does. It claims humanity must base its ethics on facts and rationality, completely divorced from supernatural claims. From this angle, morality isn't some mysterious puzzle handed down from the heavens. It simply means moving conscious creatures away from the worst possible unnecessary suffering and moving them toward well-being.
And the rationalist argument frames traditional, revealed religion as an obsolete operating system. And actually, worse than being merely outdated, they view it as actively dangerous.
Yeah, there's that comparison made in the source material, right?
Exactly. It equates clinging to religious dogma with trying to run a society based on astrology. The rationalist points out that, look, we've split the atom, we have mapped the genome, and we possess weapons capable of ending life on Earth.
Right.
So why, they ask, should a civilization with nuclear capabilities allow its foreign policy or its moral compass to be dictated by Iron Age myths?
They basically see it as trying to operate a supercomputer with software written for an abacus. But the opposing side, the theist or the pragmatist viewpoint, they push back hard against the idea that reason alone is enough. Their argument is that pure rationality is fundamentally too weak of a glue to hold a society together.
It's a really profound counterargument. The pragmatist perspective argues that human beings are not simply calculating machines. You cannot just hand someone a spreadsheet of ethical calculations.
Or a scientific paper on minimizing suffering.
Exactly, and expect them to find the motivational drive to sacrifice, to build, and to survive the inevitable tragedies of life. They argue that humans inherently need stories, archetypes, and something they call the logos.
I want to pause on that term for a second because it gets thrown around a lot in these philosophical debates. What exactly do they mean by the logos in this context?
Well, roughly translated, it means truthful, meaningful speech. But in the context of this specific debate, they're arguing it is the ultimate human ideal. The logos is the ability to speak order out of chaos. It's the idea that facing the tragedy of life voluntarily and speaking the truth while doing it is the only thing that keeps human societies from descending into a literal hell on Earth. And they argue this concept is so complex and so deeply embedded in human psychology that it had to be communicated through sweeping divine narratives rather than sterile facts.
Which brings us to a really memorable concept from the transcript. It's a phrase coined by a mutual friend of the speakers called Jesus smuggling.
Oh, yeah, that's a great term.
We have probably all been in that situation at a dinner party, right? You're having a deep, grounded discussion with someone about biology, evolution, or neuroscience. Everything tracks perfectly with the scientific consensus. But you know this person is a devout believer, so you were just sitting there waiting for the moment they run out of scientific runway and suddenly throw a theological curveball to justify their faith.
That dinner party scenario captures the essence of Jesus smuggling perfectly. It's the rationalist's ultimate fear in this dialogue. It's the anxiety that someone will use a perfectly logical, evolutionary, or psychological argument right up until the very end, only to secretly smuggle God or religious dogma into the conclusion, and therefore Jesus.
Right.
What's fascinating here is it's how this fear of Jesus smuggling completely paralyzes the broader cultural dialogue. The rationalist worries that even acknowledging the psychological utility of a biblical story will somehow soften the ground for fundamentalism to creep back in.
Give them an inch, they take a mile.
Exactly. They feel that if they publicly admit a story from Genesis contains profound psychological truth about human nature, someone in the audience will use that admission as an excuse to believe the world was literally created in 6 days. It creates a rigid standoff over where our values actually originate.
So if they don't originate from a divine spark handed down from a mountaintop, where does the biological side say these complex moral frameworks come from?
To answer that, the sources take us on a brilliant biological journey, starting with something as simple as a sea sponge sitting on the ocean floor.
A sea sponge.
Yeah. A sponge has sensory motor cells but no central nervous system. It has a basic one-to-one mapping of the world. A wave crashes against it, and a physical pore opens or closes. That is the extent of its interaction with reality. But as nervous systems evolved over billions of years, life forms encountered a massive computational problem.
Because
There are infinitely more facts, patterns, and variables in the world than there are possible physical actions an organism can take.
So if a living organism tried to process all of that infinite data equally, it would just be entirely paralyzed. It wouldn't know whether to eat, run, or mate.
And that is the exact problem complex life faced. To solve it, the nervous system had to evolve as a massive filter. It had to develop a mechanism to turn an infinite array of useless facts into a single, focused, functional action.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right, so the pragmatist argument is that this filtering mechanism, honed over 3.5 billion years of brutal evolutionary trial and error, is the true origin of our values. Values, in this view, are the low-resolution, highly functional simplifications we use to survive. They are encoded into our oldest mythological narratives because they were born out of evolutionary necessity, not top-down intellectual rationality.
But the rationalist looks at that 3.5 billion year biological explanation and says, that's a fascinating history lesson, but we don't need a PhD in evolutionary biology or an ancient myth to know right from wrong today. They bring up the incredibly stark analogy of putting your hand on a hot stove.
It cuts right through the complexity of the evolutionary argument.
It grounds the debate in undeniable reality. The rationalist argues that we do not need a supernatural story to know that putting a hand on a hot stove is a terrible idea. Suffering is a simple, undeniable fact of conscious experience. Avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone requires absolutely zero religious framing. You do not need a cosmic theology to tell you that burning alive is bad.
Yeah.
From those simple, factual extremes of visceral human experience, the rationalist believes we can scale up an entire system of modern ethics.
And that makes perfect sense from a purely logical standpoint.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the debate then shifts to how humans can extract genuine value from things we know are not literally true.
This is where the transcript introduces the analogy of the street tarot card reader. Imagine you are walking down a street, you sit down at a small table, and you pay for a tarot reading. Now, the rationalist points out that even if you know tarot cards are complete nonsense,
It's ink on cardboard.
just ink on cardboard, and the quintessential artifact of New Age superstition, the actual reading can still offer you profound, personally relevant psychological insights.
Because the cards themselves aren't doing the work. The conversation is forcing you to project your own psychology.
Exactly the point. A skilled reader uses basic psychological archetypes depicted on the cards, watches your micro-expressions, and guides you into a deep conversation about your own life. You end up discussing your lost opportunities, your anxieties about the future, your hidden hopes. The psychological utility of that interaction is undeniably real.
But the crux of the atheist argument here is that you don't have to lie to yourself about the mechanics of that tarot reading. You don't have to pretend the cards are magically channeling the cosmos or predicting the future to get the psychological benefit. You can walk away feeling understood while fully acknowledging it was just a clever psychological tool.
Right.
The rationalist argues we must treat religion the exact same way. It might be incredibly useful for community building or personal comfort, but we shouldn't lie to ourselves or our children about it being literal divine revelation from the creator of the universe.
Stripping away that literal belief, however, comes with a massive perceived risk. The pragmatist warns about the danger of the void. This is the core fear surrounding atheism itself.
The idea that atheism is essentially just a doctrine of negation.
It only tells you what not to believe. It says there is no God, but it struggles to offer a positive, motivating ethos in return. Atheism doesn't write sweeping symphonies, it doesn't build breathtaking architecture, and when people are faced with the ultimate crushing tragedies of life.
Like the loss of a child or a terminal diagnosis.
Yes, in those moments, pure scientific rationality struggles to provide a deeply sustaining narrative to help them carry that burden. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to examine the heavy historical debate the sources dive into regarding the 20th century. This is where the arguments in the transcript get incredibly intense, and we're unpacking this carefully to show the mechanics of both sides.
It really is the ultimate historical Rorschach test. When you look at the unprecedented bloodshed of the 20th century, what is the root cause? One side of this debate looks at the horrific atrocities like the gulags in the Soviet Union and argues they happened precisely because societies abandoned God.
This is the argument of transcendent accountability. The pragmatist perspective argues that when you kill the overarching religious narrative of a society, the state itself becomes the highest power. If a dictator like Stalin doesn't believe a higher divine power is watching, judging, and holding him accountable for eternity, there is absolutely no moral guardrail to stop the state from descending into total murderous nihilism.
The individual loses their divine spark.
And just becomes a cog in the utopian machine, easily discarded if they get in the way.
But the opposing side fiercely contests that reading of history. They argue that Stalinism, Maoism, and Nazism didn't happen because people suddenly embraced pure scientific rationality and skepticism. They happened because those political movements essentially became dogmatic religions themselves.
They adopted the exact same architecture as fundamentalist faith.
They really did. They had their own utopian visions of heaven on earth, their own sacred texts, their own purity spirals to eliminate heretics, and they demanded absolute blind faith in the supreme leader. The atheist argues that the core problem of the 20th century wasn't a lack of religion. The core problem was dogmatism, tribalism, and the deadly suspension of critical thinking. Whenever humans stop asking for evidence and surrender to blind belief, atrocity follows.
It reveals just how complex and layered human belief systems are. Which brings us to a fascinating metaphor used in the sources to explain how specific ideas and objects gather their immense psychological weight over time. The Elton John's glass metaphor.
Oh, this is a great one. Imagine I hold up a completely ordinary mass-produced water glass. You could buy it anywhere for $2. But then I hand it to you and say, this is the exact glass Elton John drank from during his final farewell concert. The physical atomic structure of the glass hasn't changed, but its value in your mind skyrockets instantly.
Now take that concept and stretch it across centuries. Imagine decades pass, and people start fiercely debating the authenticity of this glass. Imagine political factions forming around it, people literally fighting, shedding blood, and sacrificing their lives to protect this specific object. By the time you inherit this glass centuries later, it is no longer just a vessel for water. It is saturated with layers upon layers of human sacrifice, history, and profound communal meaning.
The pragmatist uses this to explain religious stories, ancient rituals, and sacred lands. You cannot just look at a millennia-old religious tradition and say, well, rationally speaking, this is just a normal glass. Let's just throw it away and buy a new one. It has gathered an immense psychological weight. Stripping that away overnight without a suitable replacement is incredibly destabilizing to the human psyche.
This specific tension is visualized perfectly in the debate over the cathedral dome. Imagine walking into an ancient European cathedral. You look up into the vast dome and you see a massive painting of Christ represented as the creator and judge of the cosmos.
The pragmatist argues this isn't just an arbitrary decoration. It is a profound psychological and cultural achievement. It represents humanity taking its highest possible ideal, the logos, the commitment to truthful speech, the voluntary acceptance of suffering for the greater good, and projecting it onto the highest place imaginable, the cosmos itself. It provides an orienting architecture for the human soul. It tells the individual which way is up.
The rationalist, however, looks at that exact same dome and sees historical contingency. They argue it is a product of historical luck. If the Romans had adopted a different mythological framework, we might have painted massive zodiac signs on that dome instead.
And people would be feeling the exact same sense of spiritual awe looking at a giant Scorpio.
Exactly. The rationalist warns that we must not confuse beautiful historical art or the intense emotional awe it inspires in us with literal divine omniscience.
So what does this all mean? Where does this intense philosophical friction leave us as we look to the future? Can we actually build a functional, deeply meaningful global society without God?
Well, the sources map out two vastly different roadmaps for human survival. The pragmatist argues we must preserve and continuously engage with the wisdom of the ancients. They point to biblical stories like Cain and Abel. It's a story that is only a few sentences long, yet it contains bottomless, terrifying wisdom about human envy, bitterness, and how resentment can lead to ultimate destruction.
Right.
Or they point to the ancient mythological archetype of rescuing your father from the belly of the beast. The idea that every generation must voluntarily dive into the chaotic, terrifying unknown to rescue the wisdom of the past and renew society. They argue that pure clinical rationality simply cannot replace the motivational unifying power of these ancient evolutionary narratives.
But then we have the compelling counter-argument from the rationalist side, which uses the Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius to make its point. Marcus Aurelius wrote a famous journal called Meditations. If you read it today, it's packed with incredible, life-changing, practical wisdom about how to manage your emotions, accept mortality, and live a good life.
And yet, no one today believes Marcus Aurelius was a literal god, or that his writings were dictated by the creator of the universe.
That is the whole point.
Mm-hmm.
We read his book, we extract the brilliant philosophical insights, and we completely acknowledge that he was just a flawed, regular human being living 2,000 years ago. If he gets something factually wrong about physics or human biology, we just turn the page. We don't start a holy war over a typo.
Yeah.
The grand atheist hope presented in these sources is that humanity can eventually mature enough to treat the Bible, the Quran, and all sacred texts the exact same way. We keep the beautiful poetry, we extract the enduring moral insights, but we firmly and unapologetically discard the bullshit. We leave behind the supernatural claims, the Bronze Age morality, and the tribalism without claiming the books are infallible.
It leaves us with an ultimate standoff. Two divergent paths forward for society. One path asks, do we dig deep into our religious roots to find the metaphorical spirit of the Father? The deep traditional structures and narratives that have preserved our ancestors for millennia to protect us from the chaos of modern tribalism and dangerous new political ideologies.
The other path asks, do we boldly step out of the religious frameworks of our ancestors into a fully secular future? A future guided solely by reason, scientific evidence, and a conscious commitment to human well-being, treating our old religions as the childhood myths of our species that we have finally, thankfully, outgrown.
It's a staggering question, and it's precisely why this deep dive is so vital for you, the listener, to engage with. These aren't just thought experiments for academics in ivory towers.
Because the way we as a global society ultimately decide to ground our morals is going to impact you directly. Whether we anchor our collective ethics in ancient divine narratives or in a modern rational calculation of well-being, that foundation will dictate how we handle absolutely everything. It will shape our politics, it will write our laws, it will determine our approach to programming artificial intelligence, and it will fundamentally alter how you and I cope with our own personal suffering.
This raises an important question. If humanity completely succeeds in building a perfectly rational, secular world where all unnecessary suffering is minimized by science, medicine, and reason, what happens to the human need for the sacred? Where will our innate sense of awe and transcendence live if the temples are all finally empty?